Hello everybody and welcome to part 8. In this part we're going to look at changing how our enemies actually appear in the room. So at the moment we just kind of have them set up that we have to actually manually hand place our enemies in the room, and there's a limited number of them, and once we've destroyed them all, that's kind of it. Our game just sort of ends or kind of just hangs there and there's not really anything left for the player to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an object that spawns them dynamically, just one every second or so, somewhere in our arena, so that they can be created forever, so that we always have an endless supply of enemies to fight, and we can tweak how fast they spawn and so on. And we don't want to just spawn them in a way that just makes them pop into the room, because then if one popped on top of the player, you would instantly lose, and that would be a bit rubbish. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an intermediary object, like an enemy spawn object, that like shows the enemy sort of growing in place so that you have time to move out of the way before it becomes a proper enemy. So the first thing I'm going to do is just quickly delete the enemies that we already have in the room, and then I'm going to create a new layer specifically for our enemies, because they were all on a player's layer. They were just sharing a layer with the player. So I'm going to click create new instance layer and name this layer underscore enemy. Okay, it's going to be the very top layer of our room, so you can see if I drag in an enemy, it would appear above our player, above everything in fact, because it's the highest layer that we have. I'm not going to place any of them in the room yet, because as I said, we're going to spawn them dynamically. Now that we have that layer, I'm going to create a new object called obj underscore enemy spawn. So right click in objects and hit create, and as I said, let's minimize this, call this obj underscore enemy spawn. Now this object is just going to represent our enemy objects as they are spawned into the room. Okay, so I'm going to set the sprite to be the same as SPR underscore enemy. And what we're going to do is we're going to start them off being really small, like smaller than the sprite usually is, and have them grow to full size. And when they reach full size, they'll turn into, from an instance of obj underscore enemy spawn, they'll turn into an instance of obj enemy. Okay, so go ahead and add the create event for this object now. What we want to do is change its scale. So in instances, just find set instance scale and drag that action in. Okay, and we're going to set this to 0.1 horizontal and 0.1 vertical. Okay, so in both axes directions, we're going to scale our sprite to be 10% of what it usually is. Okay, 0.1. And as I said, I'll start you off at just a really tiny sprite, and what we're going to do is grow that over time. So in order to do that, we're going to add another event. We're going to add the step event this time. As again, this just happens every single frame of the game, and every single frame of the game, what we're going to do is increase that scale. So drag the set instance scale action in again, tick the relative box this time, because we're adding or subtracting to the instance scale. In this case we're adding, so I'm going to put 0.02. okay, so I'm going to add 2% back onto that instance scale every single frame, so it's going to slowly grow. Then I'm going to drag in the if variable just from the common section, drag in this action, and I'm going to check to see if image underscore x scale, which refers to our horizontal scale. Okay, so whatever our horizontal instance scale is, that's stored in the variable image x scale, built-in variable of every object. Okay, and we're going to check to see if that is greater or equal to 1. Okay, so as this is increasing, we're going to check to see if our horizontal scale has reached 1. We could check the vertical scale as well. It makes no difference. We just pick either one, because they're always going to be the same as each other. Okay, and then if that is true, what we're going to do is drag in yet another set instance scale action and just set the scale to b1. Okay, just so in case we change these to a number that doesn't divide into 1 very well, and we would add over 1. We don't want to grow too much before this change happens. So just make sure that we always set to 1 once we've reached or gone over 1. Okay, and then once we've done that, I'm going to drag in another one from instances, which is this one, yeah, the change instance action. Okay, which allows us to basically transform an instance of this object into an instance of a different object, in this case an obj enemy. Okay, so click this button here just to select what object you want to transform the instance into, and we're going to select obj enemy. Okay, so that will work just as is now. So all I need to do is go and open the room and actually place some of these in the game world just so we can see how this works. So make sure you have the enemy layer selected and just drag in a few of these, or just select it and hold Alt, and then you can click and place a few of these in the game world. And now if I run the game, we'll get our title screen, and then when I press enter, we should see the enemies just spawn into the game world. Okay, and there they go, they appear, and then they become just our regular enemies again once they're finished. You'll notice if I walk out, they're a bit far away for me to demonstrate that, but if I was stood on one of those enemies, I wouldn't lose immediately, not while they're spawning in, okay? And that's the whole point, is to just give us a bit of time to be able to move out of the way. I mean, I suppose I could demonstrate it like this, actually. If I place that over the player, and then I just sort of... So that's clearly touching the player at the start there, but if I just... It gives me a bit of time there, and I can just see it and move out of the way, okay? But then if they touch me after they become enemies, obviously that logic continues. Cool. So now I'm going to delete these again now, because we won't need them anymore. That was just to demonstrate them working as is. What we're going to do is now create a OBJ spawner object that's actually just going to spawn these randomly around the room, right? Okay, so right click in objects and hit create, and we're going to call it, as I said, obj underscore spawner. Alright, we don't need to set a sprite for this one. It's going to be another completely invisible object this time. It's not going to do any kind of drawing to the screen, so we don't need to set a sprite. It's just going to create instances of not obj enemy, but obj enemy spawn, which will then in turn become instances of obj enemy. Alright, so add the create event. What we're going to do first of all is assign a variable, and we're going to call it spawn rate, okay? And we're going to set the word spawn rate to mean 60. And basically what we're going to do is use this variable to determine the number of frames in between each spawn, okay? So every 60 frames will spawn a new enemy. And then you can decrease that to make enemies spawn faster, or increase it to make them spawn slower, or whatever you would like to do, okay? So once you've done that, let's go to instances here, yep, and find the set alarm countdown action. Drag that in. Now what this does is it allows us to set an alarm, which means in X number of frames perform a certain event, okay? Alarms are events that you can set up in the events editor that are triggered after a certain number of frames once they've been set up, okay? Just think of them sort of like action time bombs, right? So we're going to set alarm 0 to be spawn rate, and what that means is that 60 frames from now, from the time this this code is run, i.e. when the create event happens, the event alarm 0 will run. Right now that doesn't mean anything because we haven't created an alarm 0, but let's do that now. So click in add events and select alarm 0, okay? Let's minimize this. So what do we want to happen when this alarm is triggered? Well, we want to create an instance of our enemy spawn object. So let's drag in create instance, just a little light bulb from the instances section, and I'm going to select obj enemy spawn. Be careful because it sort of is hard to see the name there. Make sure you don't select obj enemy, but select obj enemy spawn, okay? Where do we want to create it in the room? Well, we want to create it somewhere random. So I'm going to type random, and then in brackets room underscore width for the X position, okay? And so what that does is it'll return a value between 0 and whatever value we put in the bracket, so room width. So between 0 and 2048, I believe it is, okay? And for the Y coordinate, we want to do the same thing. Random, in brackets, room height this time, okay? So almost the same thing, I suppose, which will return between 0 and the height of the room. The layer we want to target is layer underscore enemy. That is with a capital. Make sure you put that in quotation marks as well. It's quite important. And we don't need to worry about target or temp right now. Then the last thing we want to do is when this alarm goes off, we want to set it to go off again, so that every time this alarm triggers, it sets itself to go off again in another 60 frames. And of course our game runs at 60 frames a second, so this means every second we're creating a new enemy. Okay, so let's find the set alarm countdown action again, drag that in under here. and set alarm 0, which is the event we're in right now, back to spawn rate. So basically what that means is we set that to the alarm to that spawn rate, and then every single frame it ticks down by 1, and then when it reaches 0 it goes off and the event happens. Okay, that's how it works. Anyway, now that we've set all that up, what we can do is just go into the game room and on layer enemy. It doesn't particularly matter what layer we put it on really, but we'll put it on layer enemy. Just drag in one instance of obj spawn, okay? Make sure you only put one in. And then run the game. And we should find, it may take a little exploring before we see one, but yeah, we can start to see the enemies appearing in our game, okay? I wish a few more would appear on the screen. Ah, there we go. You can see them just spawning in slowly over time. We can continue to fight them off. Now, there's all sorts of tweaking you could do to this. You can make it so that every time the alarm goes off, you reduce the spawn rate variable, which would mean there's less frames in between spawns, which mean they would spawn faster and faster over time, and then just set like a minimum limit on it. Or you could set it to spawn 2 every time the alarm goes off, or do any number of different things to make your game a bit easier or harder, or however you want it to feel. Okay, there's a lot of different tweaking you could do there.